Alright. So, have a couple of thoughts on something that has been on my mind for a little while and might might help those who are first hearing about it, if there are any people that are first hearing about it. So the word cult gets thrown around a lot, and this is me kind of thinking about it for a little while and deciding that I thought I understood it, and recently I've realized that I didn't quite understand why people would use that word, how people would use that word, and then realized that maybe I have some experience that might help understand why people say that the LDS Church is a cult. Because there definitely is some truth to it, but there's also a lot of assumptions built into it that are not helpful if people are trying to be helpful. I mean, they're helpful for their objectives. It just kind of depends on what you're aiming at. So the people who, from what I can tell, the people who use the word cult in association with the LDS Church are doing so either because they have experience in the church that hurt them and they feel hurt and are therefore looking for a way to help others steer clear of the hurt that they have felt, or because they've been hurt by another group, church or whatever, another church, and they want to help people steer clear of all hurtful groups, and the LDS Church just gets lumped into that group, gets lumped into the group of organizations that is capable of hurting an individual because they are quote-unquote extreme, and then kind of parsing out what extreme means. So, but the other thing that happened, so the criteria that people are using when they say the LDS Church is a cult is mostly the criteria of controlling, that these groups that they're labeling as cults are very controlling. And there's a lot of truth to that, that if you are in a cult, you by definition the cult has to be controlling. If it's not controlling, it's really hard to call it a cult. Like if you're free to come and go as you please, then you can't really say it's a cult. There's a few other things that are also required. Maybe not required, but it makes the claim for it being a cult a little bit stronger. So one is, for example, that there's a lot of shame involved, like a lot of you're bad, you're evil, you're not good enough. That type of mentality or teaching is what a lot of people describe as being a part of a cult. And then the other thing that seems to be very prevalent is that there's a shunning mechanism to it. So if you're not in the cult, you're shunned, you're pushed out, you're excluded, you are cut off, and that usually includes being cut off from family. The other thing that seems to help is that it's a small group. It's really hard to have a huge cult of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people. It doesn't work so well. I mean, it can work. There are definitely huge cults, but a lot of what seems to be the cult that people are trying to save you from are not the big groups. They're actually the small groups that are more dangerous, more prevalent. And so the LDS Church fits into that category because the LDS Church, the restored church, and the gospel is a quote-unquote high-demand religion, which is a different topic, but they're high demand because they have all these rules, commandments, restrictions, if you want to call them, and people feel tied down to all of the different expectations and standards within the gospel. And it is true that the restored gospel has a lot of expectations, and that God has expectations for us, and that we don't meet those expectations all the time, which is part of the plan, and is not intended to carry a shaming mechanism to it. That's not the way Christ did it. It's not supposed to be, you sinned, therefore you're bad. I understand that some people interpret that way and even enforce it that way, and that is pure evil. And it's unfortunate, and it's not a correct interpretation of the restored gospel, or of Christianity in general. And so the church easily gets lumped into that group because the church will tell you what to do. For example, they'll say, don't drink alcohol. It's a very easy one to point to. Do not drink alcohol. And they'll say, oh, you're controlling me, you're telling me what to do, this is an oppressive religion. Again, there's some truth to that. And the deeper truth is that you can drink alcohol if you want. We're not preventing anybody from buying or drinking or participating. So you can drink alcohol, and some members do. And that you can still drink alcohol and participate in church. You can still come to church. You can still be a part of things. There's really no exclusion. I can guarantee that in some cases it could be awkward, especially if you're with a ward that is not very understanding of things that are in your life. And maybe they will shame you in a very un-Christ-like way, and that again is unfortunate. But yeah, that kind of thing happens a lot, not just with alcohol, but with all kinds of different stuff. And so that's why the church gets lumped into the cult category. And people will say it's a cult. And they'll say that because they've either had experience or other people have had experience, and they've scared them into joining this mentality of being afraid of the church because it's controlling. And it's always difficult to not undermine the experiences of others. But most of the experiences that people have that are bad do come from childhood, where the church is oppressive to them. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that this really is typically a family problem. That there are lots of families in the restored gospel that are oppressive because parents have a lot of shame around kids that are not worthy or righteous or whatever. And that's another topic too, but it's actually a huge problem that we have parents like that, and that the parents don't have the tools to deal with that. So typically what it looks like is that the child will decide that they're going to do something against the commandments, whatever, something small, like not honoring your father and mother, like you come home late after curfew, or something big, like teen pregnancy, something like that would be considered a big no-no in the church, outside of marriage. And the parents, because they don't know how to deal with that in healthy ways, they deal with it in toxic ways, because they are afraid that they're going to be bad parents, they're going to be judged by God to be unrighteous parents, unrighteous fathers and mothers, and therefore unworthy of blessings and glory and whatever. All because their child decided to do something outside of standard. So that's, again, that is a sin on the parents, meaning the parents should not be approaching their kids' behavior like that at all. It's super, super inappropriate. And that's why the kid will grow up and say, oh my gosh, I realized I was a part of a cult. And then they'll leave and they'll say, I escaped a cult because this was my experience. The church expected me to do this, and the church standard was this, and the church was controlling. And in reality, it was parents trying to enforce church standards in a super satanic way. And what's interesting is that a lot of them will escape the cult, whatever the cult is, LDS church or otherwise, and then they will go out into the world and they will be participating in a sinful lifestyle of whatever kind, just an alternative lifestyle, or participating in the world lifestyle. And they will feel happier, and rightly so, because they are genuinely more happy when they're out free from the oppression of the cultish parents. And it's not because they don't feel better, happier because they're free from the oppression of the gospel, because the gospel is actually liberating. But they are free from the oppression of their sick parents, and therefore they feel like they can also attribute that to being free from the gospel, and understandably so. Like, it's not a very complicated situation, so it's easy to conflate one as being the other and the other as being the one. And they push off anything Christianity because now Christianity is just one big mistake and controlling environment and cult and whatever. Again, no judgment. I can totally see how people get there. And I think it is a sin of controlling and shame-filled and low self-esteem parents that don't know how to help their children become responsible adults instead of helping their children become good kids for the rest of their life. Oh man, am I getting the hiccups? Alright. So that's how the church gets labeled as that, and that's why, and that's kind of where the cult word comes from. And then something happened a few weeks ago. I heard somebody use the words cult porn, and I immediately ignored it because I assumed it was something I was not interested in. And then after a while, I realized that I think they're talking about people who are obsessed with the cultish stories. And so they use cult porn to describe people who have these hyperactive interests in hearing stories about people who have escaped from cultish groups, and mostly cultish families. And once I realized that, it immediately tied to what I've seen where people are also get obsessive with the serial killer stories. And I've watched maybe like 1 or 2 documentaries about serial killers, and I can see how it's interesting, because it's a psychological adventure, trying to figure out how people get so sick. And I think it's kind of the same thing, why people get wrapped up in this cult story stuff. Interesting. It's interesting, but it also, I don't think, is a very good use of time. It's just heart-wrenching entertainment. But as I was thinking about it and kind of looking up, the different kinds of cult stories that are out there, I realized that I actually have been a part of 3 different cults, so labeled cults. And that was super fascinating to reflect back on those experiences in those groups and look at them through the cult lens. So the first one, I was born into the Restored Church, and so that's my first cult, is that I grew up with parents that they were not obsessively controlling, they weren't pharisaical, but they were controlling, and they had to learn how to allow their children to make decisions and not take that personally. Their children make decisions. So I didn't have the cultish upbringing in the Restored Church like some people do. However, I do know of several families who had the cultish upbringing. And when their kids got older, their kids found excuses to, and good excuses, I'm not saying they're bad excuses, they found reasons to leave the church. And in most cases, it was not because they decided the church was bad. It was because they wanted to get away from their parents. They wanted to break the chains, break the ties of their parents, and say, you no longer have control of me, you evil parents. And the reason I'm going to justify that, or how I'm going to justify that, is by labeling the church as a cult. And if you're a part of the church cult, then I'm going to be cut off. And it's sad that people have to use these back doors instead of having adult conversations, but I, again, totally understand how people get there, and I've seen it many times with some of the families I grew up with and family members and different things. So that was really interesting. The second one, I was a part of a therapy group, and a couple times later on, after I left the therapy group, I heard people labeling the therapy group as a cult. And I was like, how is that therapy group a cult? Because in my mind, a cult is defined by, it's hard to get in and it's hard to get out, when that's actually not how people are defining the word cult typically. Typically they're defining it by easy to get in, easy to get out, but you are shunned when you leave. And so that was kind of a shift for me. I was like, oh, that's how they're using the word cult? So anyway, this therapy group was like that. It was easy to get in, easy to get out, but when you're in it, it's super controlling. Lots of expectations and standards. Really great group, by the way. I really enjoyed it. It really helped me a lot. But in order to help you, like, they have all these expectations and things you're supposed to do, and it's very controlling. And then once you leave, you're cut off, which makes sense because therapy groups, in case anybody's confused by this, they are a business. They're a business model. And so they don't want you participating in the benefits of the group in any way unless you're paying for those benefits. So you get cut off naturally. And so they labeled this as a cult, and then it was reinforced whenever anything negative came up about the group. They said, oh, well, that's to be expected because it's a cult. And I was like, okay. When in fact, I don't know that I would describe it as a cult, but I would say that there were people in the group that were like excessively controlling. I would say extremely controlling, and controlling to the point where they were severely punished for how controlling they were. So that was the second group. And then the third group that I just realized was a cult is that about a year and a half ago, my wife decided that we were going to start attending another church Sunday evenings, which is a whole nother story. But anyway, we started attending, and it's been really great. We attended for a year straight every Sunday, and then for the past 6 months it's been kind of off and on. And I realized that this group is also in the cult category. Now, reason for that is because they're a small group, 50 people or so, mostly from one family. There's about 30 people from one family, and they're Christian, and they're kind of fundamentalist Pentecostal, and so they have very high standards, and so they have the very modest dress, modest language. You go to every worship service, and you participate in all of the different exercises of charismatic Pentecostal Christianity. And then if you were to leave the group, you're not shunned, but you definitely are not participating in the group stuff. Like, you're not going to the services, so you feel shunned because nobody's talking to you, but nobody's talking to you because you're just not going to the group. So it's and there's probably examples, I know there's examples in other churches where they actively tell you, do not talk to that person anymore. In this church, they don't necessarily do that. But the fact that they have really high standards, it's a small group, they're controlling, it could easily be labeled as a cult, because any one of these kids is really isolated from the world, and I'm not opposed to that, but they're really isolated from the world. They have very little electronic interaction, they're homeschooled, they have almost zero public interaction, and so these kids could grow up to be adults and then realize that they're a part of a controlling group, escape from this controlling group, and then look back and say, I was a part of a cult and this is what they did. And so that was surprising to find that group could be labeled as a cult, because I thought they were pretty cool. I mean, I didn't have any cultish vibes or anything, but then again, that was my third group that could be labeled as a cult and didn't register on my radar at all. So maybe I'm just like a culty person in general. I don't know. But yeah, so after realizing this, I went to my wife and I said, hey, this is kind of what I'm learning. I'm interested to know what you think. Like, could our family be a cult or cult-ish? And if so, what ways? And if that's a bad thing, then how are we going to resolve this? And it kept coming back around to, are we shaming and controlling the kids? And our kids may grow up and say, I was a part of a cult and I escaped. But I do think that the highest priority for us has always been to create independent children. I mean, our kids are very social, they interact with people a lot, they have their own jobs as children, helping and earning money with neighbors and stuff. And so we're helping them be more independent and get out of the box, have these experiences. So I don't think that any of them would come back and say that, but who knows. The other last thing, little bonus minute here. At one point I heard one of these people who escaped a cult, and they said, yeah, these people, you know it's a cult because you walk in and they'll give you the cult glare or the cult stare. And I didn't know what they were talking about, but then they said, yeah, you know that look when they just kind of stare at you and they're just dead in their eyes because they're so trapped and controlled. And I was like, oh, I know what they're talking about. Not because I've seen the stare and described it that way, but I've seen that stare, I just described it differently. Because the stare that I've seen, I would not describe as like, get me out of here stare. And I'm sure that's out there, you know, people that are trapped, when they see people coming into their entrapment, they're looking for a way out. Like, I get that it totally exists. But I've seen that kind of stare, and the stare that I've seen, I interpret as as kind of like a person at the zoo or at the circus, right? Like, they're seeing something so novel that they stare. And the novel thing that they're seeing is someone coming into their group. Because it just doesn't happen very often. I mean, this happens in the restored gospel. You go to church and you might see a new person, I don't know, once a month. And so when that new person walks in, you're like, hey, how's it going? And then the people who aren't used to the welcoming, like the kids, they're not used to like welcoming the new people that are coming. And so they'll just stare at them and be like, are they going to be okay? Are they accepting? Are they going to be cool? Are they going to be a threat? Are they safe? Like, they've got all these questions going through their mind, and so they just stare. And this happened in the therapy group too. This happens at this church really badly, at this community church, because they're so isolated that I mean, we were there for a year and a half, and I saw one visitor that entire year and a half that was unknown to the group. There was always visitors coming through that were known to the church, but there was one that I remember that was not known to the church, and they treated them exactly how they treated us when we first showed up. When we first showed up, they would just stare and just be watching us to see if we were going to be safe and see if we were going to be interesting. And a lot of times they listened because we were interesting. They would just come up, like I would be talking to one of the adults about whatever's going on in adult world, and then the kids would come up to the conversation and they'd get next to us and they would just stare at us, just listening, and for only like 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes, and then they leave, and then another child would come in and they kind of like rotate coming in, and it's awkward because that's not how people typically socialize in the world, and so it comes across as this culty stare where you have like these these little church mice like come up and then just scurry off, and they come up and get curious and then they scurry off, and so I know in my mind that's what they're talking about, that cult stare. So I thought that was kind of a funny thing. So hopefully that helps people understand why we get labeled that way. And if I'm totally off, hit me up, whatever. But for a long time, I just thought it was weird, and it's starting to make a little more sense to me why people use that word. It's people. If somebody was to come up to me now and be like, "Oh, you're a part of a cult," I'd be like, "Oh, I understand why you're saying that. Can I ask you a few questions?" Or, "I think I understand. Tell me more." And I think I could pretty easily walk through that conversation and enjoy it. So that's it. See you.